Welcome back to our Spring Boot tutorial series. Today, we've got an exciting topic to dive into: path variables. This is an essential skill for building dynamic and modern web applications. Ready to enhance your API with powerful and flexible endpoints? Let's jump right in and see how it's done. A path variable is a part of the URL that can be dynamically replaced with a value when the endpoint is called. Path variables are used to capture specific segments of the URL and pass them as parameters to a handler method in a controller. This allows us to create flexible and dynamic endpoints that can handle various inputs. Let's look at two examples. In the first example, we have a single path variable, user ID, which can dynamically accept different values. This allows us to fetch information for specific users based on their ID. In the second example, we have two path variables, user ID and order ID. This represents a nested resource structure, where we're fetching a specific order for a particular user. These examples show how path variables can be used to create dynamic and nested endpoints, making our API more flexible and powerful. Let's get started. In our previous video, we created a GetRest API that returns a list of employees. But what if we need the details of a specific employee? Think about how, on shopping or social networking sites, when you click on your profile, you see all your detailed information. Similarly, we might want to get detailed information for just one employee. That's where path variables come in. Path variables let us dynamically specify a value in the URL, enabling us to fetch details for a specific employee. It's like having a direct link to the exact information we need. Ready to see how it works? Let's dive in and learn how to use path variables to get the details of a specific employee. Let's get started. First, we'll create a method in the employee service that takes an employee ID as input and retrieves the employee details from our data store, in our case, a map. Open Employee Service. And let's add new getEmployee method to fetch employee details by ID. Next, open the Employee Service impl. Now, let's override the getEmployee method in the Employee Service impl class. Remember in our previous video, as you can see on screen, we created an employee map where the key is the employee ID and the value is the employee object. We even added 3 employees to this map in the constructor. Now, let's make our getEmployee method come to life. We'll fetch the employee details from the map using the given employee ID and return those details. This will allow us to dynamically retrieve and display information for a specific employee. First, let's add the @getMapping annotation to set up our endpoint. Next, let's add produces equals mediatype.application_JSON_value to the @getMapping annotation. Now, let's get to the main part. We'll add the path attribute to the @getMapping annotation. We want employee ID to be dynamic in the URL, meaning it will change with each request. It's simple and cool. We use curly brackets. First, open curly brackets, then add the variable name employee ID, and finally, close the curly brackets. As you can see on the screen, the employee ID part is dynamic and will change with each request. This setup makes our endpoint flexible and capable of handling different employee IDs dynamically. Now, let's create a getEmployee method that returns a response entity of employee. We've made employee ID dynamic in the URL, but to actually use it in our method, we need to capture it as an input. Otherwise, what's the point of having it dynamic in the URL, right? This is where Spring's @path variable annotation comes in. It allows us to grab the employee ID directly from the URL and use it in our method. As you can see on the screen, the @path variable annotation has a value attribute, which is an alias for name. This name should match the path variable we defined in the URL, so Spring knows where to inject the value. But don't worry, it's not mandatory to use. Another important attribute is required. This tells us whether the path variable is mandatory or not. If set to true, which is the default, the path variable must be present in the URL. We said that the name attribute in @path variable isn't mandatory. But if we don't tell Spring which path value to pick from the URL, how does it know? Here's the cool part. If you don't specify the name attribute in @path variable, Spring uses the name of the method parameter to match the path variable in the URL. So if your method parameter is named employee ID and your URL contains a path variable of employee ID, Spring will automatically bind the value from the URL to the method parameter. Now, let's add the name attribute to our @path variable and specify the value as employee ID because that's the name we used in our URL. This will ensure that Spring correctly injects the value from the URL into our method parameter. As we mentioned earlier, specifying the name attribute isn't mandatory because Spring can pick up the variable name from the method parameter. But when would we need to use the name attribute? Suppose we have a path variable named empid in the URL, but our method parameter is named employee ID. In this case, Spring wouldn't be able to inject the value automatically because the names are different. This is where the name attribute comes into play. By specifying name equals empid in @path variable, we tell Spring exactly which URL path variable to use. This way, even if the names are different, Spring can still correctly bind the values. Next, in our method, we'll call the getEmployee method from employee service. This will give us the employee details based on the employee ID. Once we have the employee details, we'll return it. We've added employees with employee ID 1, 2, and 3 to our map, just as you can see on the screen. Now, let's start the application. Open Postman. Our application is up and running now. Click on the plus icon to create a new request. First, select the HTTP method. Since we're working with a GET API, choose GET from the drop-down menu. Next, enter the URL localhost 8080/employee. The employee part is there because we specified it at the class level with @request mapping. Now, to fetch the details of the first employee, add /1 to the end of the URL. So the full URL will be localhost 8080/employee/1. This way, we're dynamically requesting the details of the employee with ID 1. Next, add an accept header with the value application/JSON. This tells our API that we expect a JSON response. Now, click on the Send button to send the request. As you can see on the screen, we received the employee details in the response. The details show employee ID 1, name Ram, and department developers, just as we had set it up. Everything is working perfectly. Now, let's change the URL from /1 to /2. As you can see on the screen, this time we received the details for employee ID 2, with the name Sham and the department QA. This shows that our path variable is working perfectly. It's dynamically fetching the correct employee data based on the ID we provide in the URL. How cool is that? Our API is now flexible and dynamic. Let's check the API we created in the last video to ensure everything is still working fine. We'll send a request to http://localhost 8080/employee to get the list of all employees and see if there's any impact. We're getting a not acceptable status code. Last time, we set the accept header to application/XML. Let's change it back to application/JSON, then click the send button again. It's working. We received the details for all 3 employees, just like before. This means our changes didn't affect the previous API. Everything is running smoothly and perfectly. So far, we've tested with employee IDs 1 and 2, which we know are in our map. But what happens if we send an ID that isn't in our map, like 4? Let's see what happens when we try that. As you can see on the screen, we got an empty response and a status code of 200. This means our API didn't find an employee with ID 4, but still returned a success status. We should handle this case properly by throwing a resource not found exception with an appropriate response. We'll discuss how to do this in our upcoming video on exception handling. Stay tuned for that. To summarize, we learned how to use path variables to fetch specific employee details. We tested our dynamic endpoints with different employee IDs. We noticed the importance of handling cases where the requested resource is not found, which we'll cover in a future video. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any updates. See you in the next video.